Hello. Let's check our pen. So this is chapter 13 of the peripheral nervous system, and this is the last video for chapter 13. So we'll talk about reflex activity. So we're over here in the right side of our flow chart, the peripheral nervous system, and mostly for the peripheral nervous system, we've been talking about the somatic nervous system. So remember, every time you hear somatic, what do you think of? If you said skeletal muscle, joints, and skin, then you would be right. And then the next chapter that we'll cover will be the autonomic nervous system. So this is the last video in the peripheral nervous system. So this is a review from last time. These are levels of motor control. So the highest, well, let's start at the lowest level of motor control, is the segmental level, and that's just control at the spinal cord. So let's say you cut your finger, that pain sensation goes into the spinal cord. Well, let's make it a little more detailed. You just pressed your finger down on a tack and you have pain. So that's sensory input, pain, goes into the spinal cord. That information about pain is going to be traveling up to different levels of the brain, but before it can even reach the higher levels of the brain, that sensory input will cause a reflex that will allow for the motor output of skeletal muscles to allow you to pull your finger away from that tack. And maybe you've done that before. You've cut yourself, and before you even feel the pain, you've pulled your hand away or pulled your foot away from the source of pain. So reflex activity is nicely illustrated in this cartoon. So here's our blue sensory afferent neuron going into the spinal cord, synapsing with an interneuron, and then information about the reflex goes out to the skeletal muscle. And this is all happening at the segmental level of motor control. So reflexes, there's, according to Merriam, your book, there's 5 components to a reflex. So let's look at the cartoon. We've got that's a big nail. So here's a giant nail going into some patch of your skin. You can tell this is your skin, right? So here's the epidermis, and all this pink stuff is the dermis. So anyway, the nail goes into your skin. Here's a blue sensory afferent nerve ending. So this would be a dendrite. There are chemicals given off when the nail pierces your skin, and the dendrites receive that stimulus, that pain stimulus, and it's converted to an action potential. So the action potential travels along the sensory afferent neuron into the spinal cord. And anytime you see a synapse, there's going to be neurotransmitter release. So there's neurotransmitter released to the sensory afferent neuron, picked up by the interneuron. The interneuron sends an action potential, releases a neurotransmitter at the synapse with the lower motor neuron, and then the lower motor neuron is going to effectively yield that reflex response. So these 5 components in a reflex arc are the receptor. So that's the sensory afferent receptor out here, the sensory neuron itself, the sensory afferent neuron, the integration center here in the spinal cord. So integration center includes synapsing with an interneuron. And then the 4th component of a reflex arc is the motor neuron. The 5th component of a reflex arc is the effector. So the effector in this cartoon is a skeletal muscle. So reflexes are intrinsic. That means they're inborn. They're very rapid, as you probably all know. You've all experienced a reflex. They're involuntary, so you don't voluntarily initiate them. They just happen. They're usually, the pattern that they happen in is usually predictable, and it's in response to a stimulus. So for example, you're knee-jerk reflex. You've probably all been to the doctor and they check one way to check your nervous system, or a part of your nervous system is to do the knee-jerk reflex. Reflexes can also be learned or acquired, and you get those reflexes from practice or repetition. So for example, playing tennis or golf or being quarterback on the football team, it's a reflex activity, but it's a learned reflex activity. And the example here is, this is a good one, driving a car. So we went over this briefly. The components of a simple reflex arc are, number one, the receptor. We talked about this cartoon. And then I put in this sensory afferent neuron. So down here are the free nerve endings. So this could be a sensory afferent neuron for pain. So here's the free neuron endings, or the dendrites. And when the stimulus acts on these dendrites, the dendrites will do a generator potential. So the millivolts will go up to from -70, say, to could be -60, -55. But if you reach threshold potential here, then you'll generate an action potential that will travel down the axon. And here they're showing a cartoon of an action potential. Will travel, so this is all axon, and it'll travel to the axon terminal. And then this axon terminal would be this part up here in our upper cartoon. So the receptor is the site of the stimulus. That's where this thing called transduction occurs. And in terms of the test, transduction occurs when the stimulus energy causes a graded potential in the dendrite. So receptor is the site of the stimulus. That's where transduction occurs, where you go from the energy of the stimulus. So for example, the nail piercing your skin, the energy of that stimulus is converted into a generator potential in the dendrites. The sensory afferent neuron, that transmits the sensory impulses to the central nervous system. And the sensory impulses, remember another name for impulses, or an impulse is an action potential. And then the integration center occurs within the central nervous system. The motor efferent neuron conducts motor impulses, that's action potentials. I don't know why that came out APS, but action potentials from the integration center in the central nervous system out to an effector organ. In this cartoon, it's a skeletal muscle. The effector can be a muscle, like it is in this cartoon, or it could be a gland cell that responds to the motor impulse. That impulse is the action potential. And then that muscle cell or gland cell will contract or secrete something. And obviously in this cartoon, this is a skeletal muscle, it's going to contract. But if you are a gland and you're the effector and you get a stimulus, you're going to secrete something. So for example, your salivary gland will secrete saliva. Okay, we've gone over this before in the previous video, if you watched that. This is a cartoon of a stretch reflex here. So this upper part, this is all the cartoon of the stretch reflex. And then down here, this is the Golgi tendon reflex, because you can kind of see how this is a tendon. So this area is a tendon, and then this is skeletal muscle. So the first component, you have this purple capsule. This whole thing and everything in it is called a muscle spindle. The purple capsule is connective tissue, so you know it's collagen, elastin. And then within the connective tissue capsule of the muscle spindle are these modified skeletal muscle cells called intrafusal fibers. So this whole thing would be a modified skeletal muscle called an intrafusal fiber. So if you have an intrafusal muscle fiber, then you're probably going to have and extrafusal muscle fiber. So that's just the muscle that's outside of the connective of the muscle spindle. And then within the muscle spindle, you have primary sensory endings and secondary sensory endings. So the primary sensory endings, do you see how they're, so these are sensory afferent neurons, and do you see how they're wrapped around the intrafusal muscle fiber so that these things now can sense or detect the degree of stretch or tension on this intrafusal muscle fiber. And then the secondary sensory endings can kind of detect what they detect at the end of the intrafusal fiber. Sorry, the secondary endings are the purple, these purple things, and they come around and they innervate here, and so they kind of innervate at the ends of the intrafusal muscle fiber. And then you have this, the efferent motor fiber. That's the efferent fiber that's going to deliver the action potential to the fiber, the interfusal muscle fibers in the spindle. And then you have the alpha efferent motor fiber that goes to the extrafusal muscle fibers in the spindle. So these are all the components of the muscle spindle. We won't go into the details of the Golgi apparatus down here, but just suffice it to say that the Golgi tendon organ prevents excessive tension in the muscle that's pulling on attention on the tendon. So if you contract this muscle, it's going to pull on the tendon, and that's going to through the Golgi tendon apparatus, that's going to alert you that you're putting a lot of tension on your muscle. So if you want your skeletal activity to be smoothly coordinated, like we all do, you have to have this proprioceptor input. So this is the basic component of proprioception, of knowing where your body is in space, knowing how much your muscles are contracting. So Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindles both are proprioceptors. And then these are just some details. The muscle spindle itself are embedded between regular muscle fibers, skeletal muscle fibers, and you have you can have 3 to 10 of these intrafusal muscle fibers within the capsule. These intrafusal fibers are non-contractile in their central region. So can you kind of see here's the intrafusal fiber. Here's some banding out here. So you've got some modified sarcomeres. But if you look at this part of the intrafusal fiber, there's no striations. So that means they're non-contractile in those central regions. And we talked about how the muscle spindle is innervated by these sensory nerve endings. So the blue and the purple sensory nerve endings, primary and secondary. And these primary and secondary sensory endings send information about the length or the tautness of your muscle. Okay, so here is the stretch reflex, the patellar or knee jerk reflex. So let's take a look. So here you are, you're sitting on the bench, the doctor's bench here, and here's your hamstrings. Here's your quadriceps muscles. Here's the little hammer thing that's going to tap on your patellar ligament. And then this dash line down here shows you how you move your leg when the doctor taps with the little rubber mallet or whatever that thing is. So let's take a look. Number 1. So we're up here with number 1. Here's the muscle spindle that we just talked about, embedded in your skeletal muscle. And it says tapping the patellar ligament. So there's the patella. Here's the patellar ligament. If you tap that patellar ligament, it's going to stretch your quadriceps muscle. When the quadriceps muscle stretches, those primary and secondary sensory afferent neurons in the muscle spindle will sense that stretch, and those sensory afferent neurons will be excited. Number two, the sensory afferent impulses or action potentials will travel along the sensory afferent axon to the spinal cord, where they synapse with motor neurons and interneurons. So here's your sensory afferent neuron in the spinal cord. It branches here, that the axon branches, and one branch synapses with this green interneuron, and the other branch of the sensory afferent neuron axon synapses with this kind of reddish motor neuron. Okay, so at the synapse with the motor neuron, you see this plus sign. That means that the sensory afferent axon is going to release a neurotransmitter that will activate this motor efferent neuron, and it's going to send activating impulses, so that's action potentials, to the agonist muscle. So in this case, the muscle that's going to contract, that's called the agonist. So it's going to send motor efferent impulses. You get the neuromuscular junction here, and your quadriceps muscle is going to contract. And your knee will extend, but only if at the same time that interneuron will send an inhibitory impulse to your hamstrings so that they will relax. Because if you try to contract your hamstring and your quadriceps at the same time, you can't flex, or excuse me, you can't extend your knee. So this is kind of two things happening here in terms of the muscles. In the patellar knee jerk reflex, the quadriceps muscle is contracting and the hamstring muscle is relaxing. In this case, because the quadriceps is contracting, that's the agonist muscle, and because the hamstring is relaxing, that's the antagonist muscle. So when you stretch your muscle, you get a little muscle stretch here, you have this natural reflex to contract your muscle that got stretched so that you don't overstretch it. And then I tell you down here, this bullet at the bottom, all stretch reflexes are monosynaptic and ipsilateral. So all the stretch reflexes have one synapse, and they all operate, these monosynaptic reflexes. The ipsilateral reflexes means that the reflex takes place on one side of your body. Okay, and this is just, you can try to do this on your own. Okay, now there's a process called reciprocal inhibition that we just talked about. The sensory neurons from the muscle spindle, so we're talking these guys here, here's the muscle spindle, those sensory neurons, when they synapse with these green interneurons, they will inhibit these motor neurons of the antagonistic muscle. So the motor neuron of the antagonistic muscle, that's the hamstring muscle, is the purple neuron. All right, so this is a cartoon of the Golgi tendon reflex. So here is the tendon. Here, positive means it's an excitatory synapse, negative means it's an inhibitory synapse. Here's the quadriceps muscle, and then here's the hamstrings, and then here's the path. So in a Golgi tendon reflex, if the quadriceps muscle really strongly contracts, so maybe you're trying to do some leg extensions or something, have really strong contraction of the quadriceps, then the tendon organs, the Golgi tendon organs, get activated. So when you contract your quadriceps, that's going to pull on that tendon. That's going to stretch those sensory neurons in the Golgi tendon organ. If the stretch is enough, you'll fire an action potential along this blue sensory afferent neurons axon or fibers. And in this cartoon, the sensory afferent is going to branch like it did in the other cartoon, but instead of just in the Golgi tendon reflex, you have two interneurons, so two of these green neurons, whereas in the previous one you just had one of these green interneurons. So the afferent fibers of the sensory afferent neuron will synapse with the green interneurons, and the purple or pink neuron that's going to the quadriceps is going to be inhibited from contracting even further. So remember, you had a really strong contraction and you don't want to overcontract. So you're going to send, through this reflex, you're going to send an inhibitory signal for the quadriceps not to contract even more, but to relax. And at the same time, you're going to send an motor efferent impulse to the antagonistic muscle, the hamstrings, to contract. So what does a Golgi tendon reflex do for you? It helps to prevent damage to overcontracted or an overstretched muscle. Contraction of the muscle and stretch of the tendon will activate the really high threshold of the Golgi tendon organs. That means it takes a lot of muscle contraction or stretch of the tendon to activate the Golgi tendon organ because it has a high threshold. And then we talked about how the sensory impulses or action potentials are transmitted to the spinal cord, causing the contracted muscle to relax, that's the quadriceps to relax, and the antagonistic muscle, the hamstrings, to contract. And then it doesn't show this cartoon, but information about this event is simultaneously sent to the cerebellum, and then the cerebellum helps adjust. So now let's put a couple together here. This is the flexor and crossed extensor reflexes. So here you are. Oh, I just love this old-timey hairdo on this guy. It looks like he's from the 1920s or something. But here he is. He's in some kind of, I don't know, not well taken care of lake, I guess, because there's a broken bottle here. And he steps on it and gets a cut on his foot. So he immediately, as you know, that pain information will be sent to the brain. Here, sensory afferent neuron. Here's our dorsal root ganglia, information being sent into the spinal cord. But look, it's a little more complicated than the reflexes we've looked at. So here's our sensory afferent neuron, comes in and synapses with the first interneuron. So here's the cell body of the first interneuron, and the axons go out here, but check out this axon. It's going to go over to the other side. We'll see that in a sec. But initially, so the information about your cut foot comes in, and then the motor, here's two motor neurons that go out. So the quadriceps muscle, let's see, what does it do? Let's follow the neuron. So this guy, so if you want to flex your knee to pull your foot away from the glass, that means the hamstring has to contract. So we've got contraction of the hamstring, and at the same time you want to relax your quadriceps because you're contracting your hamstring. You can't have both contracted at the same time unless you're doing isometric exercises. But so you contract your hamstring really strongly. That means you relax your quadriceps. So see this interneuron that goes out to the quadriceps here is going to have an inhibitory effect on the quadriceps. At the same time that you're pulling your you're flexing your knee to pull your foot away from the cut glass, you have to stabilize yourself. So you have to have information sent over to the other leg, and that's what you do. So this interneuron sends information from one side of the cord to the other side of the cord, and then these interneurons will cause your hamstring. Let's take a look. So here's the go signal. So it will cause your quadriceps muscle to contract, and then it'll to stabilize you, and it'll inhibit the hamstring muscle. So this flexor withdrawal reflex is initiated by a painful stimulus. It causes an automatic or reflexive withdrawal of the threatened body part, that's your foot that just got cut by glass, by contracting an ipsilateral flexor. So the ipsilateral means you're on the same side. So you're going to contract the ipsilateral flexor. That's your hamstring, so that you can flex your knee to pull your foot away. So ipsilateral is on the same side of the body. Contralateral is on the opposite side of the body. So this first part is the flexor withdrawal reflex. So this right side of, this left side of the cartoon is the flexor withdrawal reflex. And then the crossed extensor reflex is this guy on the right side of the cartoon. So the crossed extensor reflex occurs within the flexor reflex, and you get contralateral. So remember, you crossed over here in the spinal cord, so you'll get contralateral stimulation of an extensor, keeps you from falling down. And then this is just a bunch of words, no cartoon. Plantar reflex. If you stroke the lateral aspect of the sole of your foot, you get flexion of the toes. And you can use this test to look at the function of your corticospinal tract. And then you guys that have kids, you've probably seen the doctor do this Babinski reflex. So you get dorsiflexion of the big toe and fanning of other toes. If it's a reflex that's pathological, these things will happen. And I think the Babinski reflex is normal in kids until about a year of age, because so seeing this in a kid is okay. Seeing this dorsiflexion of the big toe, etc., is okay in a kid, because they haven't completely myelinated their motor tracts yet. So upon complete myelination, you shouldn't see this Babinski sign or reflex. I think that's it.